Thank you, gentlelady. Now recognize the gentleman from Kansas who is celebrating his birthday today, Mr. Estes. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm grateful you're holding this hearing. We need to take every opportunity to remind the Biden administration that the Constitution provides that Congress, not the executive branch, with the sole authority to lay and collect taxes. With that in mind, I introduced legislation with Chairman Smith last night that builds upon the first retaliation bill that we passed, or that we dropped in May. It increases exposure that foreign companies have on base erosion and anti-abuse tax, the so-called BEAT, if their home country introduces the OECD's so-called undertaxed profit rule, or UTPR. I just want to jump right into questions. Mr. Plowgen, do you think U.S. businesses should pay more taxes to other countries?
First of all, Congressman, happy birthday.
Thank you.
I think it's important to, as I have mentioned, level the playing field for U.S. businesses. And Pillar 2 does level that playing field by ensuring that other countries' multinationals pay a minimum level of tax as well.
So I think a level playing field, a more level playing field, would be introduce GILTI and BEAT in other countries' tax codes as opposed to this process. With the addition of the UTPR, I mean, the 10-year projections are that the U.S. Treasury will lose $120 billion, and that U.S. corporations will pay more in taxes that will go to other companies or other countries. I'm trying to understand why the administration would do a deal that would take taxes over a 10-year period out of the U.S. Treasury, and it would cause U.S. businesses to have to pay more in taxes. I mean, what value do we get out of that over the 10-year period? That, I mean, my colleague, Mr. Swiker, talked about the first 2 years, as you'd mentioned, but over this 10-year estimate from JCT, it's a $120 billion loss of Treasury to the Treasury if we do not change our laws. And if we do change our laws, it's almost a $60 billion loss to the U.S. Treasury.
Well, I think it's important to look at the JCT analysis as an entire picture, right? So as I mentioned, the JCT analysis describes its baseline as being 40-plus jurisdictions that it's identified that have announced plans to implement Pillar 2, and what would happen if those jurisdictions implement Pillar 2 and the U.S. does not. And that's, as I mentioned, a $400 billion swing depending on the profit-shifting assumptions that JCT uses. And again, the midpoint of that range is an increase in U.S. tax revenue from other countries implementing Pillar 2.
So what the JCT projected is that the U.S. Treasury would lose roughly $120 billion. And that's the piece that concerns us the most when we look at UTPR and the impact on this. And so let me go, we have limited time. Let me go to the next question on there is why didn't Treasury focus on getting credit, full and complete credit, for the current U.S. tax code? Things like an R&D depreciation and GILTI and BEAT and some of the other provisions that are in the current U.S. tax code. Why wasn't that included in the complete negotiations through this process?
Well, I can't speak to the negotiations prior to when I rejoined Treasury. This has been an ongoing process for several years. One of the things that is clear from the Pillar 2 blueprint is that a common tax base was needed in order to be able to have a level playing field among jurisdictions. And so that's why, as far as I understand it, that's why a financial accounting tax base was adopted for Pillar 2 purposes.
But you're supportive of those provisions that were negotiated before you came on board, otherwise you would work to correct those. So you believe they're okay?
We are engaged in ongoing discussions on Pillar 2. And again, I think it's very important for us to continue to be engaged in those negotiations. We think it's important to take congressional input into those negotiations to interpret the rules under Pillar 2.
So I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think there's a strong consensus, not just in this committee, but across the country, certainly in the taxpaying community, that provisions such as UTPR are something that we don't want to agree with going forward, and that it's punitive and anti-American in terms of the approach that it messes that. And so there's need to be some additional work done before this is ever implemented. Thank you, and my time's expired, and I'll yield back.